Welcome to The Explainer, where we break down some pretty big ideas. Today, we're jumping into a really powerful therapeutic approach. It's called core issue completion therapy, but you'll also hear it called the Lukens Method. Now, this method, which was developed by Dr. Michael D. Lukens, isn't just another flavor-of-the-month therapy. It's pitched as a total paradigm shift in how we understand what drives us as human beings. We're not talking about just tweaking a few behaviors here. We're talking about fundamentally rewriting our own internal operating system. So, what exactly is this new paradigm? Well, it takes us way beyond the traditional ways we've been taught to think about addiction and offers a completely fresh and, proponents would say, a much more effective perspective. Right. So instead of focusing on things like willpower or self-control or even framing addiction only as a disease, this method completely reframes recovery. It sees it as a process of healing old emotional wounds and really fostering deep personal growth. It's a huge shift from fighting against something to instead healing something within. And, this approach isn't just theory. It was actually tested and fine-tuned for years in real-world rehab centers that Dr. Lukens was involved with. They basically served as the proving ground for the whole method. All the details are laid out in his 2-volume book set called Addiction and Emotion. The first one is titled When Escaping Feelings Becomes a Way of Life, and the second is Outgrowing Escapism, Realizing the Possibility of Transformational Recovery. And together, they really explain how we get trapped by avoiding our feelings, and more importantly, how we can actually heal. Okay, so let's really dive into this. To understand the solution, we first have to reframe the problem. And according to this method, it almost always starts way back in our childhood. You might have heard of it, but landmark research, like the Adverse Childhood Events Study, or the ACE study, it clearly shows this incredibly strong link between trauma in our early life and just a whole host of issues in adulthood. Everything from risky behaviors to disease and even a shorter lifespan. But here's where this method broadens that idea. It includes any experience that was emotionally overwhelming for a child, not just the big events we would technically label as traumatic. And that is a really key distinction. And what's so fascinating about this is the implication. This tendency we have to avoid painful feelings, well, it can absolutely develop in children who are abused, but it can also develop in kids who were spoiled and just never learned how to handle frustration when they didn't get what they wanted. The outcome, that core avoidance, is surprisingly similar. So these early experiences, they create what's called a reactive template. The best way to think of it is like a piece of code that gets written into your emotional software early on. And from that point forward, any feeling that even kind of resembles that original overwhelming emotion gets flagged as a major threat, and your system just instinctively tries to avoid it at all costs. This core refusal to feel certain things becomes a whole way of life, and it leads to what the method calls unfinished business. It's like a kind of emotional cancer that can just fester and grow over time, and is what drives all sorts of dysfunctional behaviors later on. So, if avoidance is the big problem, then how does core issue completion therapy, or CICT, offer a solution? Let's get into the mechanics of how it actually works. Okay, so this is an intentionally deep and, intense process. This is not about just sitting and talking about your feelings. It's about actually experiencing those long-avoided emotions, but in a totally safe, professionally guided setting. The whole process follows 4 key steps. It all starts with understanding the rationale, the why behind what you're doing. Then you work to identify the specific feelings you've been avoiding. The third step is the exposure, where you voluntarily and intentionally experience those feelings right there in the moment. And finally, it uses these guided actions or enactments, like, say, speaking unspoken truths to an empty chair that represents a parent, to finally complete that emotional circuit and create a real breakthrough. And this brings us to a crucial point. This work has to happen in the experiential realm, not the intellectual one. It's a huge difference from therapies that focus on just changing your thoughts. The idea here is that you can't just have some intellectual insight and expect to be healed. You have to feel your way through it. You can't think your way through it. So what's the end game here? What's the ultimate goal? Because it's a lot more ambitious than just having a big emotional release that feels good for a little while. While those breakthroughs are incredibly powerful, they're really just the first step. The real goal is something much deeper, a permanent rewiring of your emotional responses. The whole aim is to fundamentally change how you relate to your own feelings for good. Let's look at an example. Take anger. Someone who's terrified of anger and avoids it at all costs often feels totally powerless in conflicts. But by finally allowing themselves to feel and process that anger in a healthy way, it opens the door to completely new and much more effective ways of handling confrontation. And this shows the exact same principle with sadness. When a person goes from refusing to feel grief to truly allowing it, they learn an absolutely essential truth about themselves. They can handle loss. That simple but profound shift can transform everything about how they approach relationships, risks, and just life itself. All right, let's get to the payoff. Let's see how all of this builds toward a lasting, meaningful change. This is where the work really comes to life. When this completion finally happens, the results are, well, they're profound. People report not just that their old symptoms are gone, but a fundamental shift in their whole sense of self. They talk about experiencing more clarity, freedom, real peace, and a much deeper sense of their own worth and integrity. So who is this for? Well, the approach is designed for a really wide range of people, from those in recovery for addiction or compulsive behaviors to people dealing with anxiety, depression, or trauma. And honestly, it's for anyone out there who just feels stuck and is really hungry for some deep personal growth. Ultimately, the goal is to finally resolve all that unfinished business so that those old wounds aren't driving your life anymore. It's like that old Zen saying, when the shoe finally fits, you forget all about the foot. The problem just isn't a problem anymore. And that really brings us to a final thought for you to consider. What parts of your own past, what avoided feelings or unresolved experiences might still be shaping your life today, just waiting for completion?